The reason that I keep going back to alternate history is that it carries within it a natural tension between what the reader understands about the world and the way you have shifted the world. And that gives you the ability to have a little bit of distance, which often allows you to have more commentary about big themes.
It asks us to look at the possibility of our own world in a different way than say, speculative fiction set in the future does. So just because events did unfold one certain way, it doesn't mean that that was the only potential option. Um, and then I think the other thing that is, I don't know, at least the reason I keep being drawn back to it is that I think that the way that we talk about history in the present says so much more about who we are and what our goals are, what our motives are, and our perspective than it actually says about anything that actually happened in the past.
It allows us to imagine different paths. And in some ways, it makes us then question, of course, or at least understand the non-inevitability of our present, right? And I think that does a good way of challenging things, challenging, I guess, how people see the world, and understanding that things could have turned out differently, that these aren't inevitable truths. And I think it really works, especially for marginalized voices, to sometimes reimagine a past in which you can have a different future. That future doesn't have to be perfect. That past doesn't have to be perfect, but it could shift the power dynamics that we currently understand to show that, yeah, this could be like this.
What is up, everybody? You're listening to episode 157 of SFF Addicts. I'm your host, Adrian M. Gibson, and welcome to your weekly dive into the world of science fiction, fantasy, and writing craft. Joining me this week is my co-host, my bestie from the Midwestie, the queen of my days, Greta Kelly. How's it going, Greta?
Good. I'm very excited today to talk about alternate history, so it should be a good one. How are you doing?
I'm good. I got a laugh out of you. I'm happy every time. I'm scraping the barrel. I'm doing very well, thank you. I'm very excited as well. And if you want to support Greta, you can go check out her book, The Queen of Days, The Frozen Crown, The Seventh Queen, if you want to support her and her work so she can feed her lovely children.
And of course, go and support Adrian. Get a copy of Mushroom Blues wherever you buy books. And I believe it's out now in Italian. Is that what I saw?
Yes. So
Congratulations.
I don't even know if there are any Italian listeners. So, yeah, go get
there
it.
Could be. You never know.
Maybe. In Italiani, it's there somewhere. And lastly, if you want to support MJ, our other co-host, you can go check out her book, Among Thieves, which is book one in the Tales of Timor duology, if you want to help her quit her day job. She's freelance now, but she still needs that book money so she can go full-time. As well, a quick note for everyone out there listening or watching, if you want to support SFF Addicts on Patreon, you can go check that out for bonus episodes, all kinds of cool extras, author readings, and more to help keep the show going. Also, don't forget to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast app, and subscribe to the FanFiAddict YouTube channel where this and every other episode of the show is available in full video. And just a quick shout out to our newest patron on Patreon, Toby Gallagher. Thank you so much for signing up and supporting the show. And now, for our Masterclass panel here on the podcast, where we're rewriting the history books as we discuss constructing an alternate history. And we have an incredible trio of authors joining us today, each of whom has a wealth of experience writing alternate history stories. First up is Mary Robinette Kowal. How are you, Mary Robinette?
I'm doing very well. I'm happy to be back.
Yes, welcome back to the show. It's been a while, but very glad to see you. Yeah. And also welcoming back to the show, Djèlí Clark. How are you, Fenderson?
I'm good. Great to be here.
Thanks for being here, buddy. And lastly, welcoming for the first time, Sophie Burnham. How are you, Sophie?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Before we dig deeper into the episode, a quick word from our sponsor. Welcome to Transference, where death and sickness are but a distant memory. Nicholas Five Boroughs is a sicko. Someone that takes on others' illnesses. In a city where diseases can be transferred, the rich buy longer lives without pain, and the poor get a short life of constant sickness. Brought back from the brink of death by his friend Brian Meadowhearth, or maybe the invisible hand of an outside actor, Nick finally gets the chance to try and change things, to finally stop the whole disease transfer network. Tensions escalate as Nick infiltrates a higher society he doesn't understand, and starts to fall for Dorothy Sungate, the very person he needs to manipulate to be successful. And between run-ins with a talking cat, genetically modified humans, and a robotic police force, the world around him just keeps getting stranger. Can Nicholas tear down the disease transfer architecture? And how much of his humanity is he willing to bargain along the way? A dystopian vision of healthcare and a market economy, Transference will appeal to fans of Red Rising, Blade Runner, and the BioShock franchise. Soon to be a complete duology with the release of Transcendence in the summer of 2025. Transference by Ian Patterson is available now in paperback and ebook. Get your copy today. And now, enjoy the rest of this episode of SFF Addicts. All right, so to get this started, I just want to go around and we'll give everyone, since we just did names only, I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself a bit more, but also let listeners know about your alternate history books. So we'll start with Mary Robinette.
Well, I write alternate history in a couple of different forms. I write fantasy and science fiction. I started off with a series called The Glamorous Histories, which was basically Jane Austen with magic. And then I went to World War I with Ghost Talkers, and then landed in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s with the Lady Astronaut universe, which is all science fiction and this Apollo era space program, but with a meteor that smashes Washington, D.C. Not wish
Some
fulfillment when I
days.
originally wrote it.
Some days.
Just some.
If only, Greta. Oh my. Well, that got bleak real fast.
Sorry.
It's all
Right.
good.
It was me.
Amazing. Yeah, I love that, Mary Robinette. You got a wealth of different genres that you're dipping your toes into. It's like alternate history is legit one of your, like
My favorite
main
places to play.
literary jams. Yeah, it's great. Fenderson, what about you?
Yeah, it's really funny. People know me as I write alternate history, and it is one just one thing I do. I think my last fantasy novel, they were like, "This isn't alternate history. What are you doing here?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's just something I also do." And so I've written alternate history. Probably my first one was a book called The Black God's Drums, which takes place in an alternate New Orleans where the Civil War is still ongoing and there's an armistice in the 1890s. And also my novelette and novella in the Dead Gin universe, which has an alternate Cairo in 1912. And one of the things I do is I tend to imbue these alternate histories with a lot of magic, because why not? I'm already in some fictional history. Why not throw in some magic as well? And so, yeah.
Love it, man. And we'll get into that. We'll bring the magic. But I'm glad that you aren't letting the readers pigeonhole you and just being like, let me just write some straight up secondary world fantasy here and there.
Write what I want, all right.
Exactly. And Sophie?
Yeah, I'm a little bit more of a newcomer to the publishing world, but I have more extensive experience in screenwriting. Actually, I've been not a ghostwriter. Wow, this is me entering publishing now. I've been a script doctor for a while and then been working on my own stuff, hoping that it would get made. Hasn't yet, but I can just turn it into a book now. Yeah, so I've played around with a lot of alternate histories in that medium, but I just had my debut novel come out last year, which is Sargassa, which takes place in a contemporary North America, but it's a North America where the Roman Empire never collapsed and instead took over about like 3/4 of the world, including what we would call North America, what they would call Roma Sargassa. And I have 2 more books in that trilogy coming out. One of them is coming out in October, and then the next, theoretically, the October after that.
Very cool.
Very
Well,
nice.
congrats on your debut novel.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, before we get
you're a
like
Locust
to
finalist for that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the Locust, which is very cool, but kind of baffling just because I didn't know that many people knew it existed. And the Locust is reader sourced, so like people really have to read it to get nominated, so that's extra cool.
Yeah, very cool.
Congratulations. That's very
Thank
cool.
you.
That's a lot.
Well, before we get too deep in the weeds, just in case there's any complete novices out in the crowd, Sophie, maybe can you tell us how you define what an alternate history is in the context of fiction?
Sure. I would define it as, I mean, first and foremost, a thought exercise. You have to find a divergent point in history and then follow the threads of that to decide, okay, what would be different in the world building context? And then how does that affect the characters? Because first and foremost, it's still based in human characters, unless, of course, your characters aren't human, but still based in human character, human relationship. So however those given circumstances then change the character, is the thought exercise.
Fenderson, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I pretty much agree there. I mean, alternate history is, again, finding that point of divergence, and we'll talk about whether it's very far flung or more recent, and then creating a world from there. And as I always point out, I think the most interesting thing about alternate history is that point of divergence, because I think this is my thought and my theory anyway, that that is what as writers we're trying to get people to emphasize on. We're trying to say this thing was very important. And I want you to understand how important this thing was, because here we could have this completely different history that may have occurred. And so, yeah.
And Mary Robinette, do you have anything to add?
I agree with this, except that I'm going to immediately start disagreeing. Is that I'm not 100% convinced that you have to have a cusp point where, oh, at this point in history things changed. And I'm thinking of things like Naomi Novik's Temeraire, uh, His Majesty's Dragon, where it was just like, no, I want dragons and I want regency. Is there a point, like, arguably there's a divergent point because dinosaurs became dragons. Dragons exist, but like there's no it was all the same until this point. It's just like, nah, we're just layering this on top.
Yeah.
I like it. Just an alternate history cake.
Because also if you actually try to follow any of the causal effect chains that I would for it, like the world falls apart very quickly and no one cares.
Oh,
No
yeah.
one cares.
We'll get into that.
It's
Don't
like,
worry.
yeah. Just like, so
We'll talk about the crumbling facade. But
yeah.
Well, Mary Robinette, do you want to continue on a broader
Ranting.
level, like just ranting and disagreeing? What purposes can this type of storytelling serve, and sort of like what kind of commentary can it provide about the real world that other genres can't necessarily achieve?
The reason that I keep going back to alternate history is that it carries within it a natural tension between what the reader understands about the world and the way you have shifted the world. And that gives you the ability to have a little bit of distance, which often allows you to have more commentary about big themes. So those are that's one of the reasons that one of the tools that you have with, I think, alternate history that you don't have as much with some of the other forms, which is the reader's knowledge of a thing. And I would say maybe related to that is also secretly introducing them to things about history that they should know and don't.
And a lot of people don't know a lot about history. I'm very sorry for modern education systems, but it's true.
Yeah.
Sophie, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that it asks us to look at the possibility of our own world in a different way than say, speculative fiction set in the future does. So just because events did unfold one certain way, it doesn't mean that that was the only potential option. Um, and then I think the other thing that is, I don't know, at least the reason I keep being drawn back to it is that I think that the way that we talk about history in the present says so much more about who we are and what our goals are, what our motives are, and our perspective than it actually says about anything that actually happened in the past, because we can put our lens on it so easily. And I think that it helps people think more critically about what they're being taught about history.
Mm-hmm. Fenderson?
Yeah, again, no disagreement. with either of these. I think that one of the things alternate history allows us to do, again, is to point to certain points in history at times that we might find important. Certainly, the Black God's Drums, I wanted to highlight the Haitian Revolution. And so I got to highlight that and its importance. But I think, as Sophie also said, it allows us to imagine different paths. And in some ways, it makes us then question, of course, or at least understand the non-inevitability of our present, right? And I think that does a good way of challenging things, challenging, I guess, how people see the world, and understanding that things could have turned out differently, that these aren't inevitable truths. And I think it really works, especially for marginalized voices, to sometimes reimagine a past in which you can have a different future. That future doesn't have to be perfect. That past doesn't have to be perfect, but it could shift the power dynamics that we currently understand to show that, yeah, this could be like this.
Yeah,
That's
I agree.
great. Well, before we move forward, can you all share some of your favorite examples of alternate history stories, whether it's from books or TV or movies or video games? And Fenderson, why don't you kick us off? Do you have any favorites from when you were younger or growing up?
Sure. It's funny. I can't. I saw the question before, and I still couldn't think of a whole lot. And I'm sure there were, because I've just always been interested in the idea of alternate history. And I'm sure there's probably some television show or some idea in a short story or something that when I was younger that I was into, because I know that as soon as I saw that, I'd be absolutely intrigued. But I do remember one. I don't know what this short story was, but I remember these two people who were supposedly in love, and they were somebody here might know it, and they were talking on the phone to each other. Right? I have no idea the story I was when I was really young, and they're talking on the phone and they're really like, oh, this is great, because they'd accidentally called each other. And so they were like, I know I called this number back, and they're going back and forth. And don't quote me here because I could be getting this wrong. But one person says, well, I'll meet you at this place in San Francisco or something. And they say, what are you talking about? And it's like, San Francisco, right? So we can meet there. And it's like, no, the Japanese nuked San Francisco in World War II, right? That's why they won the war. And they realized that this person lives in our timeline where that didn't happen. And somehow their phones crossed alternate histories, right? And so that kind of stuff just always fascinated me. And so that's one of my memories. I don't know when I read that story, probably sometime in middle school or something, but I remember coming across that and being fascinated.
That feels
Yeah,
so
that's super
Twilight
cool.
Zone-y. I love it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very
man.
fun.
Mary
Mary Robinette, do you
Robinette,
want to go
Yep.
next?
Jinx.
I am a huge fan of Naomi Novik's Temeraire series. I love that. There's going to be a noticeable theme here because the other one that I genuinely love is also a Regency, which is Zen Cho's Sorcerer to the Crown. And I love both of them because they they take the period and they just do completely different things with it. Like Naomi's is we're going to have an adventure. But then as you get deeper into it, it is secretly looking at uh, the idea of it, it's secretly dealing with slavery because these are sapient creatures that have been uh, like made to be literal battleships. And Zencho's Sorcerer to the Crown is it's also like it just nails. It sounds like Jane Austen. It she's so good. But I love both of them because they just take what we know about the period and then just stretch it a little bit.
Your camera's moving with you as you stretch. It's great. Just a little stretch. Amazing. And Sophie?
I think my first experience of the genre without quite realizing it, because your mileage may vary on this, but his Dark Materials, that trilogy shaped me in so many ways. And it wasn't until I was an adult reading it again that I realized it kind of falls into that genre in certain ways. You know, you have a million different parallel universes, and some of them are closer to our own than others. But the other one that I think really stuck with me was Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, which I read in high school, and I just, whenever I need a good cry, I go back to that book. And, first and foremost, it was just an incredible, just an incredible novel. And again, I don't think I quite realized, oh, this is alternate history until later on. Um, and I think what really stuck with me about that book was that it didn't see, it's asking questions about medical ethics, but it's also not positioning these characters in this question of, oh, how do we break out of this unjust system. It's this question of how do we live within the circumstances that we've been given. And it's such a beautiful and heart-wrenching love story.
I love that book so much. And
Oh,
actually,
it's so
we were
good.
speaking about iffy adaptations before we started recording, but the adaptation of Never Let Me Go is actually really good.
I actually, rare case of I saw the movie before I knew that it was a book, and like both of them hold up so well.
Yeah. Andrew Garfield. It's just like
The crazy thing about that cast is that, with the exception of Keira Knightley, all of them were unknowns, and now you go back and it's just this
Yeah.
stacked cast.
It's a really good movie. And Mary Robinette, actually, I was trying to convince my wife to read the Lady Astronaut books, but she's struggling so much with reading right now. So I gave her the alternative. I'm like, we'll watch For All Mankind together, and I'll save her the books. You and I can watch the show together. But I love that there's like alternate space race.
Yeah.
Just like media across the board is fantastic. So
One of the things, actually, this is I know we'll probably segue to this, but one of the things that I love about For All Mankind, and mentioning it in the same vein as mine, is that both of them are, alternate space race, ladies go to space early. And they are so different tonally. They're like totally different stories. So for listeners out there who are thinking, oh, but all of the good ideas are taken, it's like you can take it, like you can, the direction that you're going to run is not the direction that someone else is going to run.
yeah. I mean, like one idea cannot be replicated by any two people. It's like everyone who approaches this idea will put some different spin on it. And I think when it comes to alternate history, we brought it up already, but like the divergence point, the catalyst, is kind of that point at which history branches off into an alternate world. And I think it's really fascinating, just as like a case study, to see like your divergence point in the Lady Astronaut books versus the divergence point in For All Mankind are very different.
Yeah.
Even though they're in the same vein, there is so much uniqueness to each one, and it is you are capable of reading that book series and watching that TV show and being completely satisfied with both of them, which is really cool. So Mary Robinette, do you want to lead us off in terms of like this idea of the divergence point or the catalyst? And you brought up the Temur series earlier about like maybe you don't necessarily need a catalyst. So what are your thoughts on this, and how did you kind of approach this for your alternate history books?
Yeah, so I think that there's kind of two modes. One is, and it's similar to the way you're doing any world building, that one of the modes is that you're starting from the cusp point and you're building outwards. And the other is that you have an idea for a really cool world or thought experiment, and you have to reach backwards to find a cusp point to justify it. So, in the Lady Astronaut universe, we talk about the asteroid slamming into the Earth as the cusp point, but I actually diverge before that because I have Dewey win the presidential election rather than Truman, and it's because I needed a different political landscape for the story that I wanted to tell. I needed different people in the White House. It was just a bunch of different things that I needed. So I think there's this back and forth, and with the glamorous histories, I wanted Jane Austen with magic. And so I had to think about, well, when did this world diverge from ours? Because that also then tells me how long we've had the magic. And like I figured it out technically, like there's this whole thing that happens with William the Orange, and like mortal world and fairy never separating, but that never comes onto the page. For all I know, Naomi Novik actually has worked out exactly when and how the dragon thing happened. But that's, for me, when I'm thinking about those cusp points, those are the kind of things that I'm thinking about. Either the ripple effect is part of the story, or it is a thing that you reach back for to justify.
I like it. Yeah. Fenderson, what about you? And kind of building a little bit on what Mary Robinette said, like kind of the layers of causation
Yeah.
that can kind of be in your head, but not necessarily on the page.
Yeah. I want to go back first and say, I think Mary, you're getting me to think of something different here. So I love the Zen Show books. I'm a huge Tremor fan. First of all, I read everything now. Give me a nice fairy tale set in a Slavic with ice and so forth. I'm there. So I love everything. And so I've read I read the first Tremor book, and I just had to go read them all. What a pompous, interesting dragon. But it's really, and I love Zen Show's books, of course, Sorcerer of the Crown. But it's interesting. I did not think of those as alternate history, at least until this really conversation. I thought of those as history in which you've added magic and you've added something. And so, for instance, I have a short story called The Nine Negro Teeth, The Secret Lives of Nine Negro Teeth of George Washington. That's a lot to say. And I basically talk about George Washington's teeth and I add in magic. But what I don't do, I don't really change the history of our world, right? The American Revolution still happens. The power dynamics still exist. And so that hasn't changed. I've just added an element of magic to move things along. And I tended to think of Tremomar's book, I cannot say the name for the life of me, those dragon books in much the same way, right? You still have a Napoleonic War. You still have Britain as this underdog fighting against this. And so you still have a lot of these issues with China and everything, but I didn't necessarily think of it as changing the course of the history that we have. It's, we've added dragons, right? And so same thing with Zen Show. You have a group of scholars instead of the Royal Academy of Sciences. You have one of magic. And so I tended to think of it this way, but you're getting me now to rethink, like, of course, this is also alternate history in a way. And it's probably my historian brain assigning those, and even my short story, to fantasy, right? Like, that is, even though all counterfactuals are fantasy, more of a magical fantasy. But now I'm rethinking, like, perhaps because I am always thinking point of divergence, but no, you have these worlds where the magic may have already existed, and that's a form of alternate fantasy as well. And perhaps we need to now have these different genre layers.
No more subgenres. No more
subgenres of what alternate history can be. And so I just wanted to put that out there because that's been going through my head.
No, it's a really good point.
I was like,
Yeah.
those books classify as alternate history, and they don't have a necessary point of divergence. Neither is my short story. As far as you're concerned, when you're reading it, magic has always existed.
Yeah, and same with Ring Shout and like the horror elements in that.
Yeah, even if the history itself has not changed. Right?
This is making me think, though, of To Shape a Dragon's Breath, which is a book by Monica Blackgoose that's very in a similar vein to the Temeraire. Are we saying this correctly?
Yes.
Series.
Sorry, Naomi. We're just butchering your
We're trying really hard. It's earnest, if nothing else.
There you go.
Where, again, there's the introduction of dragons as some sort of nebulous back point. And I think there actually is another divergence point that is actually in opposition to my divergence point, which is that the Roman Empire never existed. But yeah, which is a whole other
and
thought
what
exercise.
would all those men think
that's
about?
Oh
dear.
What
would they
Wait,
think?
I have a book that's similar to that, but go ahead. Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting way that it shows up on the page in the sense that she clearly knows what the causation effect was, but it's not relevant to the story. What's relevant to the story is actually the causation effect of the dragons, which means that it's taking place in the 1800s, but colonization hasn't reached the West Coast quite yet as a result of indigenous peoples having dragons. Whereas the more cultural aspects of it that are changed up by, a more Nordic culture dominating the colonist mindset, that is more, just kind of left to exist on the page and left to ask us, to leave us asking questions, but not necessarily changing anything about the way that the plot rolls out. Just, it doesn't necessarily leave us asking questions about, but how does the plot differentiate because the Roman Empire never existed? I don't think it ever actually says that on the page. We're just interested in how the plot rolls out because there are dragons.
Yeah. And what was the name of it, Sophie?
To Shape a Dragon's Breath by Monocle Blackgoose.
Nice.
And see, when I think of alternate history, I'm thinking, it's funny you brought up Roman Empire, so now I have to do Roman Empire stuff. I think of
We got it.
Stephen Barnes' Lion's Blood, right? And Stephen Barnes'
yeah.
Lion's Blood, the point of divergence there is he makes it clear. It's Alexander the Great decides not to go off and fight the rest of Asia. He decides to remain in Egypt, has himself crowned the son of Amun-Ra, and then basically Alexander the Great makes his empire from Egypt. And this alters the entire shape of history, right? According to Stephen Barnes in his writing. And in this sense, there is a Rome, but it's not very imperial. It tries. It tries to be imperial, but it ends up losing the Punic Wars against Carthage. Carthage and Egypt actually gang up, and they defeat Rome and salt the earth, and there's no Rome. And because there's no Rome, the spread of Christianity doesn't happen. Charles Martel in the Pyrenees converts to Islam. It's when he meets Muslim forces, and our entire world history is completely altered. But he gives you this clear point of divergence where you're like, well, everything before this was the history we know, and at this point, everything has changed after that. And then he gets to weave this fascinating story of this other world, even though he sets the story. Even though he starts with Alexander the Great, the story itself is set in what we would think of as somewhere in the mid 19th century North America, which is now run by Muslims for the most part. Everything from Texas to South America has been conquered by this vast Aztec empire. There are Native Americans in the West. And you have Irish slaves being sold by the Vikings who are now working plantations in North America, right? Very ambitious.
Crazy.
In that sense.
Yeah.
But like that amount of backstory to lead
yes,
to
what a
this
heck of a
is insane. It's insane.
But
right?
this is what I love about alternate history. What we were saying about things not being inevitable, the world could look so different
exactly.
than it does right now.
And this is his point. Like, Barnes is quite clear that what he's doing here is that's literally what he says. He wants to take down this notion of the world existing and the power dynamics existing as they have to exist when he wrote this, and showing that, no, it could be something completely different. And I guess getting back to the question, sorry, and we've gone off on a tangent.
No, we're talking about divergence, so it's all good.
We got
my own divergences are probably less ambitious. And I tend to make them much shorter. I tend to set my stories maybe 50 or so years out from the point of divergence, in which I kind of basically say, this is the causation that's different. This is what happens. This is what changes things. And then I allow the reader to move on from there, understanding that some of them may have some familiarity with our modern world or the Civil War. And then from there, I can tweak little things here and there. But I do make it this one point of convergence that, like Mary said, then causes this cascade of other things, right? Some things I never even fully explain, but I'll tweak it a little bit. And so, yeah, that's how I tend to do it. But I haven't been going as far as Stephen Barnes with the massive.
No, that's bonkers. You
That's
talking about
crazy.
that reminded me of Kim Stanley Robinson's The Years of Rice and Salt.
Yes.
And
it's
that
very
one
similar
had
to
like
that.
a lot of backstory and history to it as well, with like the Mongols and with the plague and all this different kind of stuff. So I'm like, man,
Yeah.
I mean, just the research. We'll get into research, but like,
In Stephen Barnes' world, by the way, Christopher Columbus is a nobody who dies in a Turkish bath.
like historical vengeance.
Nice.
Suck it.
Well, I liked what you were saying, Fenderson, about like just making tweaks here and there to
Mhm.
history. So I'd like to get all of your take about how you go about balancing what our history was versus the alternate history that you're creating. How do you decide what stays and what goes? Sophie, maybe do you want to kick off on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that again we were talking about things being things that the author knows versus things that can actually end up on the page. And my own divergence point, for example, we were talking about divergence points being really, really, really far back. My concept of what if the Roman Empire never fell had so much less to do with my own personal interest with ancient Rome, which is actually very little, and more with my interest in the sort of outsized place that the Roman Empire has in the modern American imagination. So, you remember that thing like 2 years ago about how men think about
No,
ancient Rome every
Sophie,
day?
it hasn't stopped.
Yeah.
I,
I do
It's
yeah.
still,
not.
it's still, yeah, it
So
still goes.
Well, no,
obviously
that's.
they weren't talking about me.
I'm sorry, I'm not coming at you. I think this is fascinating, though, and so
No, I mean, like if you go to if anyone visits Washington D.C., you'll be amazed at
Yeah, it looks like a
it's
knockoff of
crazy.
Rome. Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
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 And if you ask, especially when this conversation was first happening, I would then follow it up. I'd ask the men in my life, do you think about this? And if they answered yes, I would say, why? And usually it was something about, oh, democracy, or it's whenever I look at concrete. And I'm like, okay, but I don't think about Thomas Crapper every time I go to the bathroom,
No, but that's the most, dude, Sophie, the most interesting one I ever heard was like, every time I sit down on the toilet. This is what one person responded. Why? Oh, because he's thinking about the ways in which sewage systems and all of this
Oh my
was
God.
incorporated into Roman cities. And I'm like, who the fuck thinks about that while they're on the toilet? This is insane.
It's fascinating to me. And it really, to me, says something about the way that people, men, incorporate this mythos and this very sort of imagined idea of this concept of ancient Rome as it relates to the modern day and to America. So for me, balancing that history, like, for example, when I had to pick a divergence point, I just thought, okay, ancient Rome never fell. That's not really a thing. Things don't actually fall. They gradually morph into something else. So my divergence point really specifically is another thing that lives large in the American imagination, which I went into Ridley Scott's Gladiator. Again, this is not something that ended up on the page. It's just something that I know for myself is okay. Marcus Aurelius didn't pass on the emperorship to his son. He chose someone more worthy. And that had all of these knock-on effects. But that's something that the average layperson would be familiar with. You don't have to be a scholar of ancient Rome to be familiar with it. So for me, getting back to the actual question, the idea of balancing our history with alternate history is this idea of pulling from touchstones that we are familiar with, because I can't follow that entire causation. So it's a lot of, pulling from real history in order to echo that same sort of human inclination. So, for example, there is a slightly militant mutual aid society in Sargasso that I did a lot of research on, the Young Lords and the Black Panther Party, in order to understand what an organization like that would be like, how they would organize, because just because the history is different doesn't change that human need and the way that they end up structuring things. So I wanted to have these touchstones that were familiar enough that readers would come along with this very, very different, this history that changed a really, really long time ago. Things still had to be familiar enough.
Yeah, it's like tapping into human psychology and the ways in which we continue to structure ourselves and the ways in which we continue to interact in very
Exactly.
similar ways going across time.
The caste system looks very different, for example, but that doesn't change the way that humans interact with one another. It doesn't change the organic need for love. It doesn't change the way a father and a son relate to one another, even if there's this weird, like, social order situation getting in the way.
Right. Yeah. Very cool. Mayor Robinette, what about you?
So my approach is the same as any world building I do, and also at the same time, it has been different for each of the different worlds that I've stepped into, the alternate histories. So I think about the why, how, and with what effect. So why is the what is the thing that happened in the past that you know that we are reacting to? The how is kind of the story present. It's like, how does this manifest? And the with what effect is like, what are all the changes that happen around the edges and that are going to ripple forward? So with the glamorous histories, because I wanted to write Jane Austen with magic, I actively did not want to change history dramatically. And so I was always having to look at the with what effect to make sure that I wasn't like accidentally inventing telephone, which I nearly did in one of the novels. I almost invented telephone. I'm like, no, because that changes everything.
And that is the most magical thing possible. No.
Yeah, I had to come up with this whole thing. Glamour droops, and so you have to do it line. It was this whole thing, just to keep myself from doing that. But with the Lady Astronaut books, there's an asteroid slams into Washington D.C. and the why of our space race. I have changed that. So in our timeline, we go into space for saber rattling. It is just one-upmanship. One of the things about the Apollo era is like, yeah, we're gonna beat the Russians to the moon, and then everyone was like, what are you going to do when you get there?
And we're still asking that question.
Yeah. It's
Put a
a race, so
flag
we
on
don't
it.
have to have a war.
Right. So, whereas my why is that everybody on the planet is pulling together because there was this massive global catastrophe with this asteroid. And so that then has these ripple effects. So like with the glamorous histories, one of the things that happens as a result of that is that we are going into space before mechanical computers have been popularized, before miniaturization of any sort is happening. So when you need to send a computer into space, the how of this is that you are sending a woman because that's who was doing the computing. Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the real world had a policy that they did not hire men for the computer department, which is a very cool thing. And then I, as I get deeper into the series, the new book that just came out is we're 20 years out from that cusp point, and so we are diverging farther and farther from real history. And so every time I sit down to write and do something, I have to think about, okay, well, from that cusp point, what are the things that have now changed? Um, adult diapers, people have those. And things like, because of my initial why, and we get women into space early and they're doing computing, there's not the same pressure in the glamorous history in the Lady Astronaut universe to have miniaturized computers. So I have deliberately clocked all of the computing back by about 10 to 20 years, depending on the computer. Rocketry, though, they've been throwing money at that at Apollo levels. So I've bumped all of that. I look 20 to 30 years ahead of where the timeline is. And then that winds up having additional ripple effects because that means that the rest of the planet has access to really good batteries. And suborbital flights are starting to happen. So those are the kinds of things that I'm looking at, is like why, how, and with what effect.
No, it's very, very cool to think about all this kind of stuff. And it's like, all of you have done it really seamlessly. And I think that is a very hard thing to achieve. But Fenderson, we'll get your take as well on how you play this balancing act. I know your series has a lot more magic. So
Yeah.
Let's hear what
Oh,
you got.
before that, I of course have to go back to the all men think about Rome thing. I just want to point out, whenever I
Because you
heard
can't
You've
that, I
been
stop
was
thinking
like,
stop
about
thinking
Rome
about
this
Rome.
entire time.
because I would think that, let's just say, a lot of men who look like me or from communities like mine, we're not thinking of Rome.
Yeah.
And I think it also has to do with when you think about ideas of alternate history in what you do, right? It kind of says what you're focusing on. And unfortunately, as people know, within ancient people who are ancient historians or medievalists know that there is this interesting convergence of a lot of right wing and like white nationalist ideologies. And I've often, whenever I would hear the men think about Rome, I'd be, which men? And is this related to, as you were talking about, America's, this concept of America as this relationship to Rome and its relationship to whiteness and maleness that, does not gravitate towards others, right? I was like nobody I knew was thinking about Rome like that. We like gladiators, sure, but wasn't
The
trying to
other
imagine
interesting
ourselves as,
intersection, sorry, real quick.
yeah, as
The other
Romans.
interesting
And I would, yeah,
intersection is, I'm part of the queer community, and the queer men I asked were not thinking about ancient Rome.
right, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, I think there's that convergence of whiteness. Though, good luck trying to go back and explain to an ancient Roman that the universality of whiteness. And like, I'm related to the Briton. Okay. 95.
That
Really?
guy?
You sure
No
about
way.
that?
The barbarians,
Hell no.
ones who wear
Hell no.
pants.
And so I just wanted to say that because I think it does, again, say a lot about, at times, what people focus on when we think about history and what interests them. And I think it's interesting that Stephen Barnes purposely does this history, and many people, other people I've known, will have these other things that they point out in history because that's what is important to them, right? That's what they want to highlight. And of course, I've forgotten your question. So please continue.
Balance. It's all about balance.
That was my stalling, by the way, because I forgot.
It was a good stall, man. You got that professor vibe, just like
Yeah, yeah.
comes
Just
out
keep
beautiful.
talking.
Yeah. How do you balance the real history versus your alternate history?
Oh, yeah. I guess that is being an academic historian. I guess in my mind often, and so I think I was getting in trouble with the Naomi Novik things and thinking of those as history. I just always imagined that anything I made up is just not history, right? It's all counterfactual. It's all fantasy in its own way. And I suppose I have that in my head, right? So I've kind of been ingrained to think that as soon as I change something, it's just not history. And my concern is often that I don't load people with too much history because I want to say historian things and tell them this, that, and the third. And I have to remember, okay, I'm trying to tell a story here, and that's what's important. And I can't overload them with all these different intricate ways that I want to think about history. And so, yeah, for me, it's not too hard to keep those things separate. And if anything, I just have fun pulling in bits of history to give the story some aesthetic weight, right? To give the world weight itself, to make it feel lived in. So, when I'm doing the Black God's drums, I purposely bring up things about Grand Colombia or something that still exists because I want to make the world look larger. I have this one thing where I have the Californians have Russian dress because I'm talking about this small time when Russia's relationship to California. And so there are the little things I do like that. But um, to me, I always keep like the history that happened, which I have to do, the history that I need footnotes for, as opposed to the history I create for these things in which I don't need footnotes. And so that's how it helps me do so.
I applaud you for your self-control. Thank you for not info dumping that much in
Yeah.
your books. It's appreciated because I know how much you know about this stuff. This is like the first time that we ever talked. Like we were chatting about Ecuador, and then you were telling me about like the African population in Ecuador and like this
Oh, in Quito,
ship
yes,
that crashed.
yes.
Yeah, I was like, man, like
Esmeralda.
yeah, it's crazy. So
Yeah.
I applaud you for that.
The
Building on
struggle
what
is
you
real.
very much. Building on that, kind of like the details that you were talking about, I think Sophie brought up earlier about this point of the alternate history being a reflection of our modern lived experience, the experience of the author, especially. How do you kind of bring in those additional elements into the historical setting, whether it be like the science fictional or fantasy magic elements, or modern concerns, struggles, and ideas? How do you kind of infuse those elements that they feel natural in a historical setting. So Sophie, I'll toss it to you first.
Yeah, I mean, well, what's interesting is, this in Sargasso, for example, like that doesn't have much, it doesn't have any fantasy in it, despite it being shelved consistently in the fantasy section, but I don't care. Um, uh, I think what is interesting for me to experiment with in terms of bringing in science fiction is that their version of you know, their version of science fiction is technology we consider to be really mundane. So bringing in something that is, a solar powered light, for example, that is a new version of technology, it's really exciting for them. But then I have to figure out a way to present it to an audience that's really familiar with. I mean, we're not super familiar with solar powered lighting, but we get the concept and it exists. Um, we're a world that has electronics. This is a world that does not. So how do you talk about electronics from the perspective of someone who doesn't really know what electronics are, who's not a digital native, if that is something that's being introduced? So it's finding that balance. And similarly, I just ran into this in a recent draft of my second book. I had some specific real world texts by real world authors that I ended up realizing I needed to redact the titles of, because not because of anything legal, but because it was feeling like Easter eggs. It was feeling like I was like, ooh, like, do you know this one? Do you know that one?
Check out
Whereas
my inspiration.
right, whereas I was really trying to get across the content of these texts. So if someone is has a keen enough eye and is familiar with the text to be like, oh, I think she's talking about Our Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis. Like, that's awesome. But me actually putting that title in there was distracting from the writing itself. So it's just a constant exercise in figuring out that balance.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, if in the world that you've created, would that book have even been written?
Exactly.
Right?
And
So it can be very
maybe the
distracting.
answer is no. And that question shouldn't be dominating that moment.
Mm-hmm. And if you keep it more elusive, then that's actually more engaging for the reader. They'll be
Yeah, I
like,
think so.
it gets their mind a little bit more engaged with it. It's like, oh, is that the thing that I'm thinking about?
Yeah, they could say, ooh, I think I'm familiar with this. That's
Mhm.
really cool. And I know exactly what that text is, but also I'm giving enough to a reader who isn't familiar with that text to get my point across.
Very much so. Yeah. Mary Robinette, what about you?
Um, Much like Fenderson before, I have become so fascinated by the conversation that I have forgotten the question.
It's all good. We can start repeating the questions for each other. Don't
I'm
worry.
so sorry.
Don't worry about it. Just how you infuse additional elements, whether it's the science fictional, the fantastical, or modern concerns and ideas into these
Right. It
historical
was the
settings.
modern concerns and ideas that was the one of the pieces that I was, when you asked the question, I was like, I think the more history you read, the more you realize that a lot of things that we think of as modern concerns have been a concern for a long time. Um, and so the thing that I do um, now is that when I start researching, I immediately go and I look for the women, the people of color, the queer folk, the folk with disabilities that existed in history. Because in the Lady Astronaut, not the Lady Astronaut, I keep confusing my own series, the Glamorous Histories. Um, I wrote them based on the Jane Austen adaptations I'd seen, and so it was all white people all the time. And when I was researching for book 3, realized that I was really wrong. That yeah, actually there probably would have been Black people in these small towns. There were Black Roman legionaries in Scotland, and when you start researching, it's like POC folk were like in every small, maybe not every small town, but in a lot of small towns when you look at the birth and date records. So I start looking for those folks, and then I start looking for the things that they wrote, which gives me a better idea of what kind of topics people were pushing against at the time, like Mary Wollstonecraft's rights of women. There are a lot of things where that feel super modern. And an example of how this winds up playing out um, is of two. One is that with my Lady Astronaut series, I handed the book to one of my subject matter astronauts. I was going to say experts, but it was in fact an astronaut. And he read it and he said, I think you did a really good job of capturing the sexism of the time. I'm so glad that we don't have to deal with that in the program anymore. And I looked at him and I said, I need you to understand that some of the things that I put into the book that happened to these women happen to people you work with now. And his face just was like, he went distinctly pale. With the glamorous histories, I get to talk about sexism. Like one of the things that happens to in the book is my main character does glamour. Ladies do glamour as a hobby, but if you're going to hire someone, you're going to hire a man. And men who are doing it as a hobby, they're like, oh, that's a girly thing, unless they're getting paid for it, and then they're lauded. When you move into the 21st century and you look at fashion, you look at cooking, you look at a lot of different things that are considered girly, the top people in the field are men. I'm a puppeteer. It is a on the film and television, it is a heavily male dominated industry. And so these are things that existed. These are problems that existed, and all I'm doing is like just not ignoring them. And then a modern reader reading it is going to take those things and put their own lens on it. But I just look for it and then I don't ignore it.
Yeah, and you give it a chance to enter into the reader's mind once again, because
And then they can
humans.
draw parallels to their own experiences.
Exactly. Because honestly, like raising kids has taught me that repetition is one of the few ways where ideas and concepts actually get across. Is like, how many times do I have to repeat this thing until it finally like plants itself in your head? And it's like, God damn it, it takes so much more effort than I wish it did. But that's the reality of how human brains work. So I think that's a really good point, Mary Robinette. Fenderson, what about you in terms of the additional elements that you are infusing into the world and making it feel natural and not too jarring?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with a lot with what Mary just said. I mean, at the end of the day, my stories, the alternate history stories, are about us, right? That's what I always say. All these stories are really about what we are thinking about the past, what we're trying to say about the past in many ways. It has to do with what we're talking about in our present. And so I keep that in mind as I'm writing. I want to show that my characters deal with the same things that everyone else deals with, that we deal with today. I try to make them very regular characters people can relate to. And many of the issues I'm talking about, whether it's the American Civil War or issues of colonialism, none of those things have gone away, or at least they're very close, right? We're still dealing with them, we're still thinking about them. And so, yeah, I think in that way, um, I don't think that readers who are reading my books tend to think like, oh, that stuff was way back then. I think many times when we read these books, we tend to place ourselves into those situations and we see our modern selves in them.
Yeah, it's kind of like the empathy of the reader, placing yourself in a different circumstance, and that being a way to better understand just other people, other human beings.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, speaking of understanding human beings better, Mary Robinette, I loved how you were talking about you would go through and looking at like birth records and as many like first source material that you could find. Can you just maybe speak a little bit more about what your research process is like? And I think one thing that's always at least scared me away from doing anything with real world history is I would worry about falling down a research rabbit hole and never ending the research. So how do you know when you've done enough research that you can then move on?
Yeah. So I do it in layers personally. I will start with, I'm usually starting with a period that I'm already kind of interested in. Um, so I have a little bit of common knowledge about it. And then I go and read sometimes just Wikipedia, honestly, to get this like very broad, high level overview of era. And from that, I kind of refine a synopsis, which then tells me the areas that I specifically want to research. I am lucky, unlucky in that I had an experience with the glamorous histories where I think this was also book three. I think this was anyway without a summer, but there was a. I was firmly convinced that this prime minister character figure from history was going to be a huge part of the story, and I did so much research on this dude, who does not appear in the book in any way, shape, or form. Like not even his name. So that taught me to make sure that I actually understand what story I want to tell. And the story is the important part. And then I look for history that helps me find the ways that I'm actually going to tell that story. So, like with Ghost Talkers, which is set in World War One, I learned about the women ambulance drivers. Women were theoretically not allowed to go within 1 mile of the front line, and a lot of the women who were, and we weren't allowed to have combat roles. So they would drive ambulances, and a number of women were like, "This is we have to get closer." And so there was a pair of women who had motorcycles and would motorcycle up to the front lines to retrieve soldiers. And I'm like, this is incredibly badass. And so I could base characters on that and on that kind of thing. So I do that, and then uh, that helps me come up with the outline. And then as I start writing, I am reading in parallel. So my leisure reading while I'm working on an alternate history tends to be additional. It just tends to be books about the period. And then I start doing what I call spot research, which is I'm in a scene and I need to know what someone is wearing. And I'm like, I have no idea. And so I will just put square brackets, and then Jane put on a fancy dress. And then when I finish writing, I will go back and I'll look for my square brackets. I'm like, what fancy dress? And then Jane put on a dove gray dress with a pink pelisse and like,
I love the square brackets for that exact reason.
Yep.
oh my
Just
gosh.
like
Yeah, the
Control
Lady
F,
Astronaut
where is
books.
that? Where is that shit?
Yeah,
How often
yeah.
does it appear?
Yeah, the Lady Astronaut books have a lot of pieces of them are technically written by astronauts because I'm like, what? I don't have time to get a degree in this. And then the captain said jargon.
Square brackets jargon.
Square brackets. Can you play Mad Libs?
I love it. That's amazing. But I like what you said about story before history. Fenderson, you were talking about that earlier. I want to get your take on
Yeah.
because
I mean,
especially like from your perspective as a historian, as a professor, and all the ways in which you know how to research. How
Yeah.
do you go about this?
yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think, by the way, I like Mary's, that's a perfect system. I don't have I'm not as patient. And so I simply have 1,000 different Google pages open. If I need to know what someone's wearing.
Your computer's just chugging.
mean-
It's struggling, man.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's really ridiculous.
Also
when I'm
same,
really
to
in
be
it, you
clear.
can tell
Me
because
too.
my wife was like, you have 50 Google pages open. I said, I need to know what soup people drink or, eat during this time period. So I have to put it in there. But yeah, I mean, it's really similar. I think my process is I choose something I'm interested in, and that's what I'm going to write about. And I tell people this all the time, whether it's academically or you're writing in fiction, do not choose a time period that you're not interested in. If you are not interested in the Harding administration, the Teapot Dome scandal, do not write a story about that. You're just tormenting yourself. Right? Some of you, your eyes glazed over as I said it right now. And so if
No,
that's
I
not your
was I was
thing,
just like, wait, teapot dome scandal. Oh my
yeah,
god, that came up so fast on
yeah,
Google
it
search.
sounds a lot more interesting than it actually is. Don't do that, right? And so, so I'm always choosing something that I think, as Mary said, I'm already a bit familiar with, and more importantly, I'm interested in. I want to know more about this, and then I do my big research. But as you were saying, Adrian, the story is what is important, and so people often ask, when do you know to start writing? And normally you should have written a long time ago. The story is what's important. Get the story on the page. I think, as Mary pointed out, you'll always be researching. There's never a point in which you're not going to be researching. You'll be researching as you're writing. You'll be researching as you're editing. You'll be researching as the copy editors point out that, you got this completely wrong. If you have a really good copy editor, they'll tell you this thing doesn't actually happen in this Scottish Isle that you said does, and you'll be doing researching. And so I always tell
You'll be
people,
researching after the book
research is
comes out.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you'll be researching through Goodread reviews.
Yeah, you'll
I hope
research and
not.
review, right? And so I tell people, yes, there's a point at which you're researching because you're interested and you want to know more, but you have to start writing. I often wonder if at times people say they're researching, go down this rabbit hole because they're procrastinating from putting something on the page, actually having to start to write. And so I research just enough to start the story. And then as the story goes on, it determines what I need to research. But the story comes first. I often get people who ask me about alternate world history. They say it's so hard because I'm wondering if I'm writing about Paraguay, what's happening in China? And I'm wondering what's happening here. And I said, do you know everything that's happening in the world right now as we're sitting in it? Do you know what's happening right now in Hong Kong or in Ecuador or in Ethiopia at the exact same time? I said, no. So why would your book? Why would you need to know this in your world building, right? You need to know what's good enough for the story. Now, if you want to show them, be fancy, then you bring up China. You don't have to know what's going on there. You just have to bring it up a bit, right? That's it. That's a little trick I do. I'll throw in something that I have no idea what Californians in Russian dress means. I'm not going down that rabbit hole, but brought it up. So you get this idea that the world is expansive, that it's big, that it's lived in, but I don't know anything about that, right? As the creator, your main focus should be the story. And I think that the history that you're researching, whatever you're researching, is to drive that story, or like the Californians with the crazy dress, aesthetic,
Yeah.
right? That's what I call that. The
But
bit of
then
aesthetic.
it's like you're
Just
sending
sounds
the
hot.
reader. You're sending the
It
reader
sounds
down a
good.
rabbit hole.
Right. And if you want to do some fan fiction and go down that rabbit hole, feel free. I'm not going there, right? I have no intention of ever writing anything else on the Californians and their odd Russian dress in 1890s alternate history of America.
I want to know
Right?
all about
Just
this now,
in
though.
there.
Yeah.
You've doomed Sophie. Well,
Yeah.
Sophie, how would you go about researching Californians and Russian dress?
Writer prompt,
Oh,
folks. You got
I
it.
would start writing the character first. I agree with everything that's been said already. I'm such a chaos researcher. I start with the character first. I start with the situation first. I start writing, and then I figure out who the heck these people are. I think that for me, I'm much more character based in the sense that when I start my initial research, which is nowhere near as organized as Mary Robinette's is, I've started writing and now I have to figure out if I'm writing it right. But my research usually doesn't necessarily start with textbooks. It starts with trying to immerse myself in the reality of the lived experience of that time period. So that means reading, other people's fiction. It means if it's in the last 100 years, it means listening to music. It means watching films from the era. It means getting a really, profound sense of what it actually felt like to live there. It means reading other narratives where people are, just living their daily lives, their triumphs and their failures within that context. And then when I realize, okay, I need to fill in my own context. I don't really know what this word means. I don't really know what that scandal they're talking about is. Then I go to, Wikipedia.
And at the very least, like Wikipedia, it's like you can delve deeper into the
They've got their
the
hyperlinks.
references at the end. Honestly, I think that as long as you're not writing an academic paper, I think Wikipedia is a fantastic place. And honestly, even sorry, Fenderson, I don't know if this is scandalous as a professor, but I think even for an academic paper, it's a pretty good place to start.
Yeah.
Just
I mean,
don't
like
quote
Ray
it.
Robinette was saying, that's like the broad strokes. Start with
Yeah,
Wikipedia.
and then you get deeper.
Yeah, deeper and deeper. Well, speaking of getting deeper, I feel like when you get deeper into a historical time period and you write this alternate history book, and then you put this book out, and then there's just so many fucking people who decide you're wrong about everything. All these history buffs, and for anyone who's listening in audio, I have giant ass air quotes there next to history buffs. We had a question from our patron, David Hopkins, who's saying he shies away from this genre because it seems like you can't win. Everyone just knows enough about history to disagree with your take. And he said it's catnip for the contrarians. So how do you kind of deal with the people who, I mean, like, I was talking to our other co-host MJ about this. You're right about guns. There's someone who will just like eviscerate you about the fact that your take on guns was wrong. So it's like, how do you approach these kinds of naysayers and history buffs who are far too keen on critiquing every historical fact in your book? Sophie, I'll go with you first.
I was so scared of classicists coming for my throat. I call myself a fake classicist because it's not what I'm. The research, again, research is Wikipedia research. However, I have actually found that the classicists that have read this book have been the most excited and generous and just kind of stoked about it. Whereas, yeah, it's the self-proclaimed history buffs who like to poke at it. And I was so nervous about this happening, and then as soon as it happened, I just realized, oh, like anything else, you can't please everyone, but so it's not worth trying. Just please yourself.
Yeah. I mean, I felt the same way with Mushroom Blues because I was like, there's going to be some mycologist or biologist who's just going to tear me apart. And then actually, like, one of my friends is a microbiologist who studies bacteria and molds. And she read the book and she loved it. And I was like, thank you. Thank you. And then someone on Goodreads, like, gave me a 1 star because my book started with a glossary of like mycological terms. I'm like, you can just piss right off.
Yeah, honestly, I
That
think
is
that
not for you.
the experts who have these very niche areas of expertise, I think when other people are paying attention to them, it's very exciting.
Yeah, I agree.
We just want more
Fenderson?
people to talk to.
Yeah, not that the Roman Empire is niche, but I digress.
Fenderson, what about you? How do you deal with all these contrarians?
Oh, I mean, I just say be quiet, nerd. No, I mean, at the end of the day, it's like I don't have too many contrarians. I do have some people. Like I remember, I have sometimes people don't agree with things because they don't think they're real. But like I had someone was when I did a Master of Gin, they were Fatma, would you really have a woman in this part of the world dressing like this? And so I was like, I'm glad you asked because here is a Lebanese photographer who, in the early 1900s, took photographs of women in many parts of the Middle East and North Africa in suits. Shut up and go away. And so I tend to sometimes react to it that way. And then a reminder, people who try to get into minutia that this is all counterfactuals. We're all creating things here. If I'm talking about the inevitability of history, nothing says that the way I say it goes is the way it would have happened, right? It's all quantum. And so to get into these arguments is kind of ridiculous. I remember there's a documentary called The Confederate States of America, where it's done by a black filmmaker who imagines the Confederacy wins the Civil War. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but here's the trick. It's actually about our world. And it's actually about the lost cause at the end of the day and the fact that did they win? Because culturally, so many of the Confederacy things are part of our culture. It actually uses commercials. It creates these commercials based on actual products that existed. At the very end of the film, it shows everything I put in here came from our world post Confederacy, right? And so that's the question it's really asking, and it's a mockumentary, in fact, of Ken Burns' film, complete with their own version of what's his name, the guy who sounds like Foghorn Leghorn, the folklorist from Ken Burns' film. You know what I'm talking about. Blanking on his name right now. But interestingly, I saw that screening, and there were these people in there who were like, "Well, do you think?" And it's like, you're missing the whole point of this. The point of this are not these little tidbits of history and would this have happened. The larger story he's trying to tell you is about our world, and you're missing that and looking for these bits of these little pieces to pick on. And I think at the end of the day, I think anyone doing alternate history, we're trying to tell these larger themes, right? We're not trying to figure out exactly what would have happened if the Roman Empire didn't fall, or if an asteroid strikes Washington D.C. We're actually talking about something bigger and more complex. And so I try to let the contrarians get out of their own head and try to let them step back and see the big picture that we're trying to talk about.
And then tell them, shut up, nerd.
Yeah, and
Yeah. I think
That should
much
go on a
like
t-shirt.
I think much like anything else that exists on Goodreads, that is simply none of my business.
basically, yeah, I don't read that thing. Yeah.
No.
Because
Never-
you get contrary things. This person, I've had people like, there's not enough history. It's too much history. Well, why don't you guys get together and figure it out?
Yeah.
For anyone that's
Neuro-
listening, I need them to know that there's a cat on Mary
There
Robinette's
is.
shoulder right
There
now.
is.
Yes.
Just go over
It's
to
very
YouTube and like
exciting.
go to like a minute or an hour and 11, and then you'll find a cat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what does your cat think about nitpickers and history
Yeah.
buffs?
Yeah, speaking
she
of
thinks
catnip. Fuck the
Yeah, she
haters.
thinks that they are rude litter box. Yeah, this is Elsie. So I have a pretty snarky reply, which is that, when I get naysayers and things like that, I'm like, I've been pretty inoculated to it because I'm a woman on the internet. And this is a thing that just happens when you have an opinion. Even when you don't have an opinion, when you just describe something that you did that day, people will like just show up and be
And put their butt in your face.
butt in your face. They're just gonna shit on your head.
Yeah, pretty much.
Thank you for that, Elsie. Good timing. So there's a certain degree of like, I've been through that already. And so if someone's going to come after me, and people do, like with the glamorous history is one of my favorite things. It somehow got just shelved in historical fiction or romance or something. And this woman wrote to me, not knowing that she was reading a fantasy, and she said, "I'm British, and I've never heard of glamour. I think you made it up." And I'm just like, "Good job. Well done. Well spotted." Well, yeah. Um, and then with the Lady Astronaut books, I actually have a a template email response for people who write to me and tell me that Elma's math is wrong in one particular section. And the email template response reads, "Thank you so much for writing to me. I took Elma's math equations in this from Werner von Braun's calculations for Mars. Here is a photograph of the page that I took it from." And I have never had any of those people respond to me, weirdly. So
Their egos have
like,
been shattered.
right. So basically, the point of this is that they will be mad at you for things that you got right. So you can't be worrying about them being mad about something that you may potentially be wrong about, because they're just, anyone who's going to be mad is going to be mad, and they are not your audience. They're not the people that you're writing the story for, so they don't matter. They're not going to read your next book, so you don't need to placate them. They're not part of the people that you're having a conversation with. And at the end of the day, a lot of what a story is having a conversation with someone. So I just don't care. I mean, to be clear, I will get really mad and sometimes write extremely snarky responses that I do not send.
Just to get it out of your system.
Yes.
She
Sometimes I will
cares,
send
but
them
only in her
if I,
drafts.
yeah.
But now you
I
can just
have
say,
a-
"Shut up, nerd." You've already got
Yeah.
the perfect clap
I
back.
gotta admit, I can get away with a lot of that. I do not. I always say I'm a dude on the internet, and so I do not get half of the nonsense.
Yeah.
I see it as others. People pick things like I got a call from the Sad Puppies when I was nominated.
Oh, Jesus.
I didn't know who they were at
Oh.
first, and when I figured it, I didn't even know it was happening. But it was one of them who asked me, "What does it feel like being an affirmative action?" What you call it is when it clicked on me, and I was out on my porch, and I just cussed him out like I was from Brooklyn. Right? I cussed him out pretty good, and they got off the phone with me. So
Yeah.
I can do that. Whereas realized not everybody can, and I probably I don't get half of that stuff, and so
I feel like the important through line specifically for the person who asked this question is that it is not specific to whatever genre you choose to do. People are going to get mad
Correct.
about anything. I
Yeah.
had someone who was mad because one of my characters was a misogynist when that is very important. That is a very important element
You
of his
must be a
character.
misogynist, Sophie.
Yeah.
Like, yes, well done. Good
Misogyny
reading
exists?
comprehension.
What?
All my characters are exact reflections of everything that I believe.
I mean,
Really?
don't you know that depiction is inherent endorsement of a thing?
Oh, yeah.
Oh my god. The internet's a fun place, isn't it?
Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
so don't, to the person that asked this, don't let
Yeah.
that dictate what genre you decide
Yeah.
to write or not.
No.
But I
Hopefully
think
that
this
helps
all
people.
like leads into interesting questions about the legitimacy of history itself. Like how do you think your own alternate history stories are in certain ways commentaries on the fact that so much of the real world history is based on so many biases, misunderstandings, revisionism, lies, assumptions, and everything else.
Fenderson is our resident historian. Do you
Oh,
want to
nice.
join?
You know, great question about, is history a lie agreed upon? No, I mean, as historians, I always point out to students that bias is not necessarily bad, that we have bias in the very things we decide to study and what we have an interest in. We have bias in understanding power dynamics. It's why if we're looking at the Holocaust, we understand we don't flatly look at a concentration camp guard and a concentration camp victim the same way. We have these biases that are based on moral decisions and ethical decisions. And so there are at times good reasons for bias. And when we look at history, right, we're not just looking at it flatly. On the other hand, we of course have the negative bias and the bias of the archives, that the archives themselves are based on the things that people decide to collect, and they're not asking everyone what they thought and conserving everything for everyone, right? So the archives themselves have biases, silences, and what have you. And so, yeah, I think a lot of times, again, I go back to this. I know I sound like a broken record. At least for me, when I am doing alternate history, I am kind of like Stephen Barnes. I want you to pay attention to this thing because I think it's important. I think the Haitian Revolution is important. I want you to think about how this impacted our world. I want you to think about how it relates to this thing, the slavery of the Atlantic world, which lasted longer in the Atlantic world than it didn't, right, in the modern world. I want us to think about I want us to think about the Civil War and its impact on an international scale and all those kinds of things. With A Master of Jin, the same thing. I want people to think about the bigger pictures of colonialism and ideas of anti-colonialism and think about what a world would be like if colonialism did not play out the same way. And I also want magic in there. And I want you to think about human relationships and things like that. And so, yeah, at the end of the day, I let people know like what I'm doing is not history. I tend to create nice blog posts where I will talk about the things I pulled from if people want to go back and find out more information. But at the end of the day, yeah, I'm not giving people history. I'm giving people maybe a nice little prompt or a guide to go look up the actual history and histories and to see the different perspectives and ideas that come out of this, because history's messy, I think, as you point out.
Yeah. And actually, after reading the Black God Drums, I listened to the Revolutions podcast.
Yeah,
They had like an entire season on the Haitian Revolution.
yeah,
So
it's
it's
a great
like, oh
podcast.
hell yeah, this is great. It's basically like it gave me like so much extra context for the book I just read, like this
Yeah.
alternate history book. So it's really cool that
And that is what, as a historian, I've done my job here. I can leave. That is exactly
check
part
out.
of
I'm good. Thank you so much.
Well, I'd say like the nine Negro teeth of George Washington. That's a perfect one, right? I could not. I'm not going to lie to you. I want to talk about. I want people to explore the founding father, perhaps owning teeth that belonged to enslaved people that may have been his enslaved people. I want people to have those conversations. I want people to confront that, right? And I'm well aware of what I'm doing. I want people to confront our national mythology of George Washington and his wooden teeth, and to think about why people tell that story instead of these other stories, right? And how the whole idea of those teeth comes to us because of one little notation in a book, right? That we don't know anything about it, to understand that how much of history we don't know. And yeah, I want people to then think about it. So yeah, certainly.
Right on. Sophie, what do you want to add on this topic of the legitimacy of history?
Well, it is my turn to ask you to repeat the question.
How the alternate history stories comment on the fact that so much of our own history is biased and misunderstood.
Yeah, well, I think
written by the winners, as everyone likes to say.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what's so funny is that, you know, of all the various alternate history projects I've written, the one that actually has made it out to readers or, you know, people ingesting it is the one that's probably the most nail on the head on the nail, no, nail on the head. Or, you know, that idea of the legitimacy of history is the whole point. I was kind of laughing to myself when Fenderson was talking about the archives, because within Sargasso, there is something called the Imperial Archives, which very much, you know, the story is very much about who gets to write the official narrative. And I think that that's a really important thing to be asking your readers to consider anytime you're talking, you know, in any alternate history, even if you're specifically narrowing in on one specific era rather than just the concept of history, which is kind of what Sargasso is. It's an investigation of the legitimacy of history. Like, I kind of opened this talking about how, in my view, history says more about what a person or a regime, you know, thinks, or their worldview, or what they want, how they want to control other people, than what actually happened. And I think that I think that alternate history invites readers to, it invites readers to investigate that a little bit more.
Yeah. And I think that question was perfect for you. It's like,
I'm trying not to give too much away here.
No, it's okay.
I'm trying really, really hard not to give too much away.
Avoiding spoilers, but at the very least enticing people to check the book out.
Yeah, I'm dropping little like birdseed in my
Little
wake.
nuggets, yeah. Come read my book this way.
Yes. There's only so much I can say here, but I promise you it's relevant to what we're talking about.
Yeah. Greta,
Well,
you got into witch mode again, just like come hither.
You know, it's my default mode these days.
Well, maybe Robinette, what about your take on this topic of the legitimacy of history?
You know, again, informed in large part because of the really big mistake that I made in the first two books of the Glamorous Histories. A lot of what I'm doing is I'm writing for a past version of myself. So just so we're clear, by the way, for listeners, I know that you're hearing occasional.
We've got a fifth participant or a sixth.
So my cat Elsie uses buttons to talk, and the speaker is one of the. Anyway, she is very done with me being on this podcast, and so that's why she is now saying all done in the background.
Go check out Mary Robinette's Instagram to see how her cat talks and communicates.
Oh my goodness, choices that I have made. So a lot of it is like I start off knowing very consciously that I have internalized a lot of media, and that there's a lot of stuff that I'm just very wrong about. And so it's not that I'm saying, you know, my audience is only white women who are less than 56 years old. It's that I'm writing for people who were not taught these things. The education system in the United States erases even before the erasure that is happening now. It has always erased and left things out and left people out. And so I know that I'm writing for people who didn't learn this. And the way I handle it is that I just let it be an active part of the background and the world that my character is moving through. So, you know, the example that I give from my real life is like, I'm 5'7". my husband is 5'11". We cannot reach the same things on the shelf. So it affects the way we move through the world. But I don't run through my world going, oh no, if only I were 5'11". My 5'7" self cannot reach things. I must wear heels at all times. Like, I don't think those things. I think about it when it breaks. When my normal gets interrupted by something else. And so when I'm writing about these biases and I'm putting them to my fiction, I am letting my character run through the world as their normal self, and then I let them experience those roadblocks, those places where it breaks. And I find those, through my research, through reading first person accounts, through talking to people, but mostly through listening. Hurry treat. Hurry treat.
We got a hungry cat.
Well, that's probably our sign that we should start closing out. So do any of you all have any final piece of advice for the writers out there looking to rework some history into their stories? Mary Robinette, do you want to continue while your kitten's cooperating for a little bit?
Just don't teach your cat to talk.
I mean, it's super cool. But
really cool.
The real advice that I have is that you've spent your entire life honing your taste as a reader, and your personal experience and that taste are going to inform your writing, and that is one of your strengths. But it also means that you are carrying imprints from other people into your fiction with you. And so the best thing that I can say is learning to make decisions about which imprints you want to carry on intentionally and which ones you're doing by accident is one of the best things that you can do as a writer.
That's a very good piece of advice.
Beautiful.
Sophie?
Fenderson, how about you?
No, Sophie goes first.
Oh, God.
You're making me follow that up. That was so good. I think, as with any genre, I had this genius playwriting professor in undergrad who just had so many pithy, wise pieces of advice. So Kyle Bass, this is yours, and I'm just disseminating it to the masses. Specificity is the death of cliche. So the more specific you can be, do your research, get your broad research in, but the more specific you can be about the story that you're telling and knowing why you're telling this specific story, the more universal it's going to be received.
Very good. Thank you, Kyle Bass. Via Sophie. Now, Fenderson?
Yeah, I guess I don't have too much to add to that except to tell people, don't be afraid. As I've argued before, don't be afraid of history in adding history. I know people seem like, I don't know if I can, but I always tell people all speculative fiction is based on history because, whether you're talking about the past or secondary worlds or, whether you're in far-flung Frank Herbert Dune or you're in George R. R. Martin type faux medieval type worlds, you're basing it on some element of human history because, as I keep saying, the dolphins have not shared their history with us, nor have aliens come to do so. We only have human history. And so I always say it's just a degree of how much history we're using. Everyone is using it. I think for those of us doing alternate history, we're being much more intentional, much more specific in that history. And so if you think of it that way, that everyone is using history anyway. It's the only thing we know when we try to create, and when we try to imagine the future, when we try to think about the past, whether it's on this world or another. Think of it that way. And so when you decide to use history, it's just how you plan on using it, right? Is it going to be in a way where the history is a complete secondary world, or are you going to be more intentional where you're pulling on histories that people are more familiar with to do so directly from our world? And so, don't be afraid.
And that's a fantastic note to end on. And thank you three so much for doing this masterclass with us. Mary Robinette, Fenderson, and Sophie, you're all amazing. And this has been super informative. So I hope anyone out there who is afraid, David, our patron, and whoever else, don't be, just go into it with intention and do your research. But yeah, I think there are a lot of genres that seem intimidating, but once you dig into it, um, you know, the process and the craft, those are kind of the things that will keep you going along, and don't get bogged down in like, oh, well, I have to read this many books and blah 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 blah. You know, it's like write the damn story, and everything else will come as a result. So thank you three so much for doing this with us. It means a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
guys.
so much for having us.
An absolute
Good
pleasure.
talk.
All right. Well, we'll just close out. I'll give you each a chance to share your social media, to say a little bit about your latest book. Fenderson, we'll go with you.
Oh, my latest. Well, it's middle grade, so it's no
It's very
alternate
good.
history. My middle grade book, second book in the Benny song, came out last week, the week before last. Yeah, sometime like that. I'm so bogged down in book 3 that I have no time to think about that book 2 came out. But if you want to find other things that I've written, short stories or books or novellas or what have you, you can find them at pjelieclark.com.
Awesome. And Sophie?
Yeah, you can find me on, I almost said Twitter. You cannot find me on Twitter. You can find me on Blue Sky at sophieburnham.bsky.com. You can find me on Instagram at Oh For Fox's Sake, which was something I got in 2011, and I cannot give it up. It's too good.
It's like getting your first email address and it's horrible, and you just keep it.
No, but it's actually really good. And then
is
you
really
become
good.
a
It is
professional
really good.
who people need to find, and then it's confusing. But you can find this all at my website, which is just sophieburnham.com.
Awesome. And your first book, Sargasso, is out now. When
yes.
book 2 you said is out in October?
Yes, book 2, Blood Tide, is out in October. And book 3 in the Ex Romana trilogy is theoretically going to be out in October of 2026.
Awesome. And Mary Robinette?
So Martian Contingency, which is book 4 of the Lady Astronaut series, just came out. It is theoretically a standalone, works as it, although it is definitely also a book 4. And then in October, I have a book coming out called Apprehension from Saga, and it's a double. So
I saw this. That's with Sam Miller. Right?
Sam Miller.
So cool.
Yeah, that one is really okay. Sorry, that's the cat.
Your cat is fed up.
There was a thunderstorm earlier, and she was very upset by it, and so she's been hiding, and now all the storm is over, and now she is the storm.
Now she is the
storm. The easiest way to find me and my cat is to visit my website, maryrobinettekowal.com. You can sign up for my newsletter, which will let you know what I have going on. You'll get monthly updates and cat photos and videos in your inbox. Also, a short story on your birthday.
Aw, that's awesome.
Nice.
That's awesome.
Well, we're having lots of animal love on this episode. MJ will be jealous, but
yeah.
You can.
My dog also just came in and is now sitting on my feet. So
amazing.
My dog has been right off screen this whole time, and I'm genuinely shocked that she got up once.
I saw her jumping around.
Yeah, I thought this was going to be a way bigger problem than it was.
Closed door. I can hear him down there
scratching the hell out of your door.
If I had a closed door between me and my dog, yeah,
that
would have been worse.
All right. Well, you can also follow SFF Addicts across the board at SFF Addicts Pod. You can follow me at Adrian M. Gibson. You can go check out Mushroom Blues if you want a little bit of fungal noir in your life. Greta, what about you?
Yeah, I'm across socials at Greta K. Kelly, and you can find my most recent book, The Queen of Days, wherever you buy books if you want a little dose of thieves with more swagger than sense trying to take out a fallen god.
Right on. And speaking of cats, if you want to support MJ, you can go check out her books to fund the Thorin Food Fund, which is her cat's name. He's 90% fur and he needs more fat, so go give her some love. For now, keep reading, keep imagining, and we'll see you next time on SFF Addicts.